in this section, we'll be studying early Roman history. So, as we've done before, we need to start with geography. Right, we'll be looking at Roman geography. First of all, note that the Romans are a peninsular people, right? They're people who are going to develop their civilization on a peninsula, which is a landmass surrounded by water on three sides. And I think a lot of times what happens when you have people who grow up on a peninsula, you tend to have a lot more harbors. There tends to be a lot more openness around them because of the ocean, and they tend to be more expansive, right? They're going to be people who are going out. Just, we saw something similar with the Greeks, right? Well, that's what we see also with the Romans. What's also important to note is you can't quite see it on this map, but Rome itself, the city, grew up along a river, the Tiber River. So again, that theme is continuing. The Tiber River is surrounded by plains, so Rome was situated in a place where it would be able to get plenty of water and had lots of nice flat land where it could grow lots of food, which of course is necessary for establishing a city. Now, Italy has mountains just like Greece has mountains, but the Italian mountains are different, right? Remember when we talked about Greece, the Greek mountains made it difficult to unify politically. That's not going to help hurt the Italians so much. The mountains are just not as rugged. They're not laid out in a way that would create the exact same divisions as it caused for the Greeks. There is still some issues with the mountains, but it's not like what the Greeks had. In addition, these mountains to the north, the Alps, for the most part, with one big exception, which we'll talk about in another section, offer a lot of defense. Right? It makes it so that that it's a natural barrier that gives the Romans some time to develop their civilization. So the Romans are set in a place, I think, where they have a good foundation for agriculture, thanks to the plains and the Tiber River. And also they have the area around them is set, is not so divided that they can't conquer it. Right? The mountains are not so rugged that they can't conquer the surrounding area, and they've also got the Alps, which will protect them from people coming from the north, at least somewhat. And one thing I want to emphasize when we talk about the Romans, we're talking about not simply a civilization, but also a state, a government. Right? So the Romans aren't just a civilization, they're also a full-fledged state, a government. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tell some stories from Roman history. What I think is fascinating about these stories is that they're entertaining because it's just not what you might expect a group of people to talk about themselves in this way, right? Usually we think about people telling a past that kind of glorifies them and says how awesome they are. And we'll see the Romans do some of that, but they also just look kind of bad in the history that they tell about themselves. And I think it gives you some sense of what the Roman civilization was. So first of all, the city of Rome was said to be founded by two brothers, Romulus and Remus. And the story goes that they were abandoned. I believe it was because a Vestal Virgin, who is a priestess that tends the sacred fires, one of them became pregnant. And that's a big no-no. That's why they're called Vestal Virgins. And she gave birth to them and abandoned them. And then they were nursed by a she-wolf, right? So you've got people who claim that the founders of their cities were nursed by a wolf, which makes them, kind of wild and wolfish themselves. Incidentally, I guess the word she-wolf was also slang for prostitute. So you've also got that in there. So what's going to happen, though, eventually they go on to try and found Rome. And there's a kind of, the brothers, there's a rivalry between them, their sibling rivalry. And one thing they are doing is they're building the city walls. Romulus is building the city walls. And Remus says, these city walls aren't very tall. They're no good. Look, I can jump right over them. And so Remus jumps over the city wall, kind of mocking his brother, saying, see, you don't know how to build a city wall. And Romulus responds by killing Remus. Right? So Romulus is building the walls. Remus says, oh, these walls aren't very impressive. Look, I can jump right over it. And Romulus says, here, let me introduce you to my knife, and stabs him to death. These are stories the Romans told about themselves. So then, Romulus built his city and said, okay, I've got a city. Now I need people to live in it. So he puts out a call to, he puts it out, out there. He starts telling people, hey, come move to my city. if you're like a criminal and you're wanted and you need a place to hide, come to my new city. No questions asked, just move on in. So the first inhabitants of Rome were mostly a bunch of criminals on the run from other cities. Great. So, and then of course most of these were men, and the Romans needed wives. So they invited the Sabines, a nearby group of people. They sent them some invitations to a party, and they said, "Hey, we just founded a city. You may have heard of it, Rome. We're going to have a party to start it. So please, we hope you can come. Please bring your unmarried daughters. Be sure to bring that." That's what the invitations say. I mean, I'm being silly, but what they're doing is the Romans want to get wives, and their plan is for the Sabines to come and bring all their daughters with them, and then the Romans will kidnap them. And according to the Roman stories, that's exactly what they do. The Sabines bring their families with them. The Romans pick up all the like they have like a signal after everyone's had plenty to drink. And then they grab the daughters and run away with them. And wow, there's a lot of things to say about this. I'm just going to say these are the stories the Romans told about themselves. So then what happened was the Sabines weren't too particularly happy about this, and got an army and came back to Rome, but it took them a while to get ready to have the army. So the Romans by this time had children with their Sabine wives. And this is just really weird by our taste, so I'm just going to describe what happened. The Sabine women, who had now been married to their Roman husbands for a while, and who had children by them, were very devoted to them, and there was about to be a war between the Sabines and the Romans, and the women came out with their children and said, "Look, stop fighting. Please don't kill our husbands, and please don't kill our brothers and our fathers. Let's just have peace." And that's why they're out there with their children. So again, kind of an interesting story. Tells us something again about the Romans. So Romulus is good at going out and conquering people and tricking people into bringing their daughters so they can kidnap them and force them to marry. Okay. So you would think people in Rome, at least, maybe not the Sabines so much, but the Romans would like him, but he was kind of a tyrant. We shouldn't be surprised by that, considering, he killed his brother because he made fun of him. So Romulus was kind of a tyrant, and even though he did a lot of things that, the Romans liked and went out and conquered people, they didn't like him much. So the story goes that he was performing a ritual ceremony with a bunch of other elite Romans one day on a mountain, and there was a storm, and boom, Zeus, that is, the Romans call him Juno, but it's the same god, Zeus brought him up into heaven. Right? That's the story, that Romulus was out with a bunch of Roman leaders performing a religious ceremony. A storm came up, and the clouds descended on Romulus, and he was brought into heaven by Zeus, Juno, the gods. And that's what's being depicted here, his ascent into heaven on a chariot. What's more likely is that during the storm, and while they were away from other people, the elites said, "We're sick of this Romulus guy. He's kind of a jerk. Let's kill him." And they all killed him. And then they said, "Yeah, we'll just tell everyone that he was taken up into heaven, and we'll just throw the body in a river or something." So, interesting stuff, right? So what happens then, and I think this is really fascinating, is the guy who succeeded Romulus was the brother-in-law of Romulus, right? So Romulus apparently didn't have a son, or for whatever reason, he didn't succeed him. So his brother-in-law, Numa Pompilius, succeeded him. And Numa is an interesting guy. He's now king of Rome. And Numa was like, "Oh my gosh, these Romans, they're a bunch of criminals. I just can't do anything with these guys." And the story goes that a nymph, a divine woman, so she's not quite a god, but she's above humans. I guess you could kind of, if you were thinking in Judeo-Christian terms, she's like an angel. This nymph comes to him, according to Roman tradition, and teaches him religious rituals, which he then teaches to the people. And what's very important about Roman religion, these rituals he teaches the people, is that they're meant to emphasize good social behavior. So, maybe you shouldn't kill your neighbor. You shouldn't steal from your neighbor. If you do, the gods are going to smite you. So what's interesting about Roman law is it's very religious. There's a very strong religious element to it. And the Romans had all these very intricate details. Like if they wanted to declare war, they had to have a reason. Other civilizations, they would just declare war without a reason. We just want to conquer stuff. But the Romans were convinced, in part because of Numa's ideas, that if you're going to have a war, you got to have a reason. And you got to declare war properly, both to the people you're going to attack and to the gods. So you have this very interesting character among the Romans. On one side, they're very militaristic. They're very bellicose. They want to go out and conquer everyone. On the other hand, they're also very religious. And we have to be careful about the term superstitious, because superstition is often just used as a word for religious belief that I don't like. You know, it's like, oh, that's superstitious because it's a religious belief I don't believe in. But the Romans themselves would say, yeah, we're kind of superstitious, right? But the whole idea of this was to try and bring social order to these warring, fighting Romans who were constantly in conflict, to bring them law, and basically to put behind it this idea that the gods will punish you if you don't follow the rules. Now, just to give you a concrete example of what I mean by a superstition, that even themselves the Romans thought was kind of odd at times, but how it was meant to kind of discipline the people, is the sacred chickens. I love the sacred chickens. So the sacred chickens were brought like out if you're going to have a battle. So the Romans were thinking about attacking someone, having a battle. They would consult the sacred chickens. Now, how do you consult the sacred chickens? Easy. You feed the chickens. If the chickens eat, that's good. You should have the battle. If the chickens don't eat, that's bad. Don't have the battle. Now, in this image here, this is a Roman naval commander, and he was really excited because they were in a place, they had gotten the enemy in a good position, that he wanted to attack the enemy, and so they said, wait a second, we got to feed the sacred chickens. So they fed the sacred chickens, and darn it, the sacred chickens didn't eat. And he was very upset, right? And people were like, oh, we can't attack because the sacred chickens won't eat. And he was mad because, of course, he thought this was the perfect time to attack. So what he did was he had the sacred chickens thrown overboard, saying if they're not hungry, maybe they would like a drink. And of course, the sacred chickens drowned. He attacked the enemy, and he lost. So if you learn one thing in this class, it is never defy the sacred chickens. In all seriousness, though, the point of this and of Numa is to give us a sense of this character of the Romans. That on one side, they're very warlike. On one side, they're very religious. And you can think of those things as conflicting, but the idea was religion was meant to discipline them, was meant to make them so they didn't fight amongst themselves so much. And the Romans took these things very seriously, and they will tell stories like the sacred chickens just to show what happened when you didn't take these ideas seriously. Now, one thing I just want to note before we continue on is that there were very strong similarities between the Romans and the Greeks. What's interesting is the Romans really respected the Greeks and respected Greek civilization and would always borrow Greek civilization because they respected it so much, but then claim that they developed it themselves, which I think is interesting. But they also borrowed the Greek gods. So Zeus is is Greek for a god, which the Romans would call Jupiter or Juno. So I do want to point that out. Now, you maybe are like, wait a second, I thought Rome was famous for being a republic. Right? Rome was famous for being a republic. You were saying the Romans had kings, and that's true, they did. So how did Rome go from being a monarchy to being a republic? And it has to do with an event that is very odd from our perspective, kind of uncomfortable to talk about, but I'm going to do my best. And that event is the rape of Lucretia. So basically what happened was some Roman aristocrats were out, and also they were with the son of the king. This is a different king. This is a man named Tarquin. So what happened was and this shows kind of how patriarchal in a sense the Romans were. Wanted to have a contest to see whose wife was the best wife. So they went around and to each one of their houses secretly to spy on their wives. And all the women, except for one, were just lounging around, just taking it easy, weren't doing anything useful. But Lucretia was weaving. She was weaving. She was making clothing for her family. And remember, this is a rich aristocratic woman. And so everyone agreed that Lucretia had the best wife, right? Everyone agreed Lucretia's got the best wife because look at what she's doing. She's not lounging around, having a good time. She's working. Of course, you can see the patriarchy here because the guys were just playing around, right? But then they're criticizing their wives for taking it easy. In any case, what happened was Tarquin's son, the king's son, was like, wow, that Lucretia, she's pretty awesome. So he went to try and have an affair with her. She was a good woman, was loyal to her husband, wanted nothing, good Roman woman, this was the ideal, wanted to have nothing to do with this guy, so he raped her. And so what happened was she then, after this terrible act was committed, she went to find her husband and asked for witnesses. And then she told everyone what had happened to her, and then she pulled out a dagger and committed suicide. So, like I said, this is kind of disturbing stuff. Why would she do this? Basically, there's this idea that she had been insulted and had undergone shame. And unfortunately, in a patriarchal society, instead of saying to a woman who has suffered rape or sexual abuse, instead of trying to comfort her and help her find healing, there was a tendency to blame her. Why did you let this happen to you? Which is really horrible. It's terrible. I need to make that clear. Some people kind of take a relativistic view and say we can't judge history. I think at times we can. I think this was a terrible thing that, women, instead of trying to help a woman, finding healing, instead of trying to bring her justice, you would blame the woman. But this is a patriarchal society. That's what they did. So in order to show that you were blameless, that you did nothing to bring this on, to show that you did not want this to have sex with this man, to prove that you were sincere, the woman would commit suicide. Right? That's what Lucretia is doing. She's trying to wipe away her shame, to say, look, I didn't want this. I didn't do anything to bring it on. To prove to you that I really am a good woman, I'm going to kill myself. And that's what she did. Like I said, this is terrible. And of course, I want to stress, you should not kill yourself if something like this happens, or just, you shouldn't kill yourself. And if you do ever have something like this happen to you, or have the desire to do so, there's, Lander has counseling services and a wellness center and things like that. They will be happy to help you. But what happens then, of course, to get back to history, I had to put that in there just to make it clear this is wrong and to let you know about the services available. It may seem odd, but after I've done that, I've had students come to me and say, hey, look, thank you for telling me that. I'm going to go. Can you tell me how to get to the wellness center? What happens is, of course, Lucretia's husband is extraordinarily upset. His friends are upset, and they say, it's time for vengeance. But what's interesting here is they don't just say this was a bad person. They say, monarchy is bad. Kings are bad. One person should never have so much power. It's because the king is a tyrant that his son behaved in that way. The king is a tyrant. That's why the son behaved in that way. We're not going to just overthrow the king and get a new king. We're getting rid of monarchy. We're just getting rid of it. No more kings. Because this is what happens when you have one man who has too much power. Remember, the Romans are patriarchal. They don't have queens. So they overthrow not simply a monarch. They don't simply overthrow a king. They get rid of monarchy. And they swear an oath. And the people of Rome, or at least the males of Rome, get together and swear an oath that they will never have another king. And they will kill anyone who tries to make themselves king. Like, they really hate the idea of the king. And they then establish a republic. Now, as we'll talk about later, it's a republic dominated by the aristocrats, by the elites. But this is, in a sense, revolutionary, quite literally. They don't just get rid of kings, or a king, and just get a new king. They get rid of kingship, monarchy itself.